Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. My name's James Nicholson and I work for Moreton Bay Public Libraries. I'm really excited today to bring you the first in our new mini-series, and today's episode is 3 Things with Ben Law. But first I would like to begin with an acknowledgement to country. I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gubbi Gubbi and Ndambi people and the traditional country on which this event is taking place, and the elders both past and present. I also recognise those whose ongoing effort to protect and promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures will leave a lasting legacy for future elders and leaders. So today I welcome Australian author, journalist, podcaster, playwright maybe, and all round, and this is, I like this little phrase, witty raconteur, maybe, Benjamin Law. We're really grateful to you, Ben, for taking the time to chat to us. And instead of a normal interview, I wanted to do something slightly different. And that was to ask you to bring along 3 objects. And the idea being that those objects would kind of, I guess, represent a little bit of who you are, maybe give us a little insight into, the shaping of where you got to today and why they mean something to you. So I guess it's kind of a getting to know you in 3 objects, a bit like a show and tell. And we only just avoided the calling it show and tell, but I quite like that name. It's quite innocent, I guess. But before we get started, I just wanted to ask you, whether or not it was really tricky picking out just 3 things. I mean, it's quite hard. If I think about, if someone asked me, what things define you, what 3 things, that would be pretty tricky. So, yeah.
Well, James, I'm a professional storyteller, so you could throw anything at me and I could just probably make something up about it. But for me, no, look, I had these 3 things close by in my office. It's nice to be talking to you on Gubbi Gubbi land, by the way, because that's where I was raised. But I'm having this conversation with you on Gadigal land, part of the Eora Nation. But right now I can't really engage with much of the landscape outside because we're locked in indoors. So I just really had to look around in my office to see what there was. And I realized, because the office is my space from which I work, I like having little mementos around me. I try not to hoard because I come from a bit of a family of hoarders. I try to be sparse. I try to be minimal. But when I landed on the 3 things that I thought would be good to talk to you about, they were actually all in this room. I try not to let my stuff bleed out into the other areas, in case my partner goes completely insane. But when I looked around, I realized actually I'm now at an age where I've accumulated some items, not just for the sake of having stuff, but because they actually mean something. So happy to go into this show and tell for adults, which sounds almost a little bit sus. I'm glad you didn't go with that title either.
Yeah, that's quite why we, avoided slightly that angle, I would say. But yeah, it's really interesting.
It's a different kind of Zoom meeting.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I guess we'll get to, there's some clues we'll just say, because I was fortunate that you let me into an idea and what you were going to be talking about. So I'll just say that there are some clues in the image that everyone can see right now around what you might be talking about. Before we get to that, I'll let you get started with the first object. So yeah, what have you brought to show and tell, I guess?
Okay, so I forget the order in which I was going to present them, but maybe I'll just start with my friend here who's closest by. This guy, it's very almost culturally cliched of me to have a ceramic Buddha, but I actually didn't have a ceramic Buddha in my house up until last year. Last year, at the start of 2019, I filmed a documentary for the ABC called Waltzing the Dragon. It was a 2-part documentary, and it was all about the now over 200 years of Chinese-Australian history. A lot of people still always think, Chinese migration, it's quite a recent thing. You might have heard a little bit about the gold rush, but in some ways, the Asian and specifically Chinese Australian experience does start 200 years. In some ways, the trade with Australia starts before white people even arrive on this continent. So the documentary was as much an examination and interrogation of Australian history as it was my history with my family. But obviously, it was kind of a fact-finding mission as well, because I only know that much about my parents and where they grew up. I've never been to where my dad grew up. So for the second episode with my dad, I go to this tiny southern Chinese village where he grew up, which is still standing. He's trying to get like village family members to renovate it so he can sell it one day. But it was this incredibly eye-opening thing to see the house in which my father was born. Like, he was literally born on the floor of this house, as well as the house in which he spent his childhood. You know, he could show me the mountains where he used to race up as a kid, show me the bedroom where him and his mother slept, my grandmother, my mama, slept for many, many years, and to see how rice was unhulled and how this was a pre-electricity era, so how the kitchens worked. It's remarkable. And in amongst all this rubble, which was like almost this archaeological dig, the builders and these extended family members had found artifacts, objects that would have belonged to not just my grandmother, but my great grandparents, her in-laws, who lived in that house. And in amongst them was this guy. You know, I guess he's kind of like non-assuming, but for me to even have it in Australia in my house, all the way from China, from 3 generations ago, it feels like things have come full circle by having this guy in my house. You know, this everyday kind of object. This, who would have granted a lot of luck to the people who lived in the home then, but just to have it now in 2020, I don't think they could have conceived of what this present day moment would have looked like, the family that my ancestors would have grown, the whole migratory aspect of our family, I think is kind of encapsulated in one object, how far we've come.
Yeah, and I guess actually, like, you say that they wouldn't be able to kind of envision where we are now, but equally, we can't envision where they were then. That's quite a, it's quite an odd kind of connection, I guess. And it would seem, when I watched that documentary, it seemed that your journey could have really created more personal questions maybe than and conflicts than actually initially answer them all. So has it
Mm.
ignited, is that the case? Is it going on that journey ignited more questions, or did it kind of solve some of those questions you might have had? I mean, it'd be
I
tricky.
think it was more of the latter, James. It's a really well observed thing because, like, if you're going to open a Pandora's box on your family history, what are you going to find? Are you going to find, in some cases, slave owners, or are you going to find like horrible, horrible stories of interfamily abuse or anything like that? But in my case, I think when you're the child of migrants, every generation above us may as well be a kind of a foreign alien kind of community or experience, right? But when you're the child of migrants, that sense that you can't quite understand the generation above you, let alone the generation above them, really becomes amplified and compounded. And so m- for me, understanding that my mother was also the daughter of migrants, it's the fact that I always took for granted because she grew up in Malaysia, being Southern Chinese, but grew up in Malaysia. It's not like she ever went back to China to find her roots either. So us finding them together answered as many questions for her as it did for me. She literally found a seat at the family table, at the shrines where her family, her ancestors had gathered. That's a remarkable thing. I think for Dad, it was less of a discovery because he knows where he was born. He
Yeah.
knows where his family comes from, goes back generations. But for me to be able to see that meant that I could understand and connect with my dad a bit better. And when I've spent my life in this country for a significant proportion of it, really not quite understanding my heritage nor my place in the world, and the people around me also really struggling with this idea of Asian Australian, like how can you be both of those things simultaneously? Now that I know my heritage and my story so precisely that I can even pin it on Google Map, it's actually made me feel much more confident about who I am, who my family is, and our journey, our story of how we came to be here.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's interesting. I mean, I could talk a day. I won't go all day. I'll just say a few more things. But what I found interesting as well is that you talk about ancestral homes, and that I guess is only a couple of generations. So, do you think with your family, and an extended family, that in a couple of generations people will look back at Nambo and come traveling from wherever they are? Do you ever think that maybe they'll travel back to the Sunshine Coast, the kind of homeland of where you grew up or where you're from?
Oh, James, with the pandemic and with climate change, it's nice to think that there will even be generations to
Well,
look
true,
back on who we are.
true.
But I don't want to say that too despondently, because my nephew, the first of the next generation, has just been born. And I like that his mother, my sister, and his aunties and uncles now have a clearer picture, not just of who we are, but of who our parents and our grandparents and our great grandparents were. My nephew is now in a room in our sister's house that has, I mean, I've kept the Buddha, but my sister, who's a professional photographer, she's kept the portrait of our great grandmother that I found perfectly preserved while filming this documentary, that has lasted decades and decades through ruin and rubble and through a revolution, essentially,
Yeah.
to be able to survive, for us to take it back to Brisbane and to be framed and preserved. So hopefully little Cohen, our little nephew, will have a very strong sense. So I don't think he'll need to make a pilgrimage, because we've now got it on video
Yeah,
and we've got it in the artifacts that we surround ourselves with.
Ah, no, that's awesome. It's fantastic. Well, like I say, I mean, you could talk all day about just that documentary alone, but we will move on. I would just like to say though that if anyone wants to watch that, Waltzing the Dragon documentary, you can access it. It's on the internet through the ABC. I forget actually which side I was.
Yeah, it's through ABC iView. That's right.
iView. Yeah, yeah. So you can. It's in two parts. The first part is when you go back with your mother back to her ancestral homes and place, and then the second one is based around your father and actually going up. And I found the second one really interesting from an Australian perspective when you go up to Arnhem Land and you're looking and you're kind of engaging in that kind of first connection between that Chinese heritage and the Australian First Nations. That was really powerful. So
Yeah,
but
it's a
like I
really
said,
good history lesson.
it is, and so I'm sorry. We will have to move on. We'll move on to our next object. So what else have you got to talk about for us today?
Well, the next object has actually been hiding in plain sight the entire time we've been talking, James. And the only reason I bring it up is because it's such a political thing lately. But it's my bookshelf. So this is one of probably 3 bookshelves in our home. So one bookshelf is underneath the television. It's just got like graphic novels and cookbooks, blah 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 blah. It's your bog standard IKEA bookshelf. But when my boyfriend and I moved into our new apartment, we were able to get furniture like custom made for the place to fit, which sounds very ostentatious, and I guess it kind of is. But because it's a relatively small apartment as well, we wanted things to fit just right and make full use of the height of the apartment, because there's not much width. And so for me, this is all of my nonfiction books. And I've arranged it by color, which is very, very controversial in many circles. I mean, we were talking before we started recording, James, about the politics of how we shelve. When people see that I've color coded it, I think like a third are really impressed and go, "Ooh, maybe I should organize my books by color too." And then the rest are just completely appalled and absolutely disgusted. But the thing is, I really love my bookshelves because not only can books live there, but there are these tiny nooks, and that it's been made like that by the designer Kate Campbell, who's a mate of ours, and the builder Alex Clapham, who's also a mate of ours. But all those tiny nooks are there to be filled by other things, whether it's this little Buddha or the other item I'm about to show you,
Oh, yeah.
all that sort of stuff. So I'm really pleased because it feels like a piece of grown-up bit of furniture that I've never had before.
Yeah.
This side is the non-fiction, the other side in the other room is the fiction.
Oh.
I'm just very smugly happy with it.
Well, I guess the question comes is so we we know that back in 2018 you were made an ambassador of the National Library of Australia. So when they made you an ambassador, and they have known that that's how you categorize your books, do you think maybe retrospectively they might strip you of your ambassadorship, or do you...
Yeah, I think the diplomatic language is persona non grata. I would have become persona non grata to the National Library of Australia. Look, I'm a big fan of the Dewey Decimal System, right? I'm going to back that up always, always, always. I love that form of categorization. But I have to say, for me, I've also been a bookseller for a very long time. And maybe this is how librarians, booksellers, we're kind of the same species.
Yeah.
And when I was a bookseller, I spent years, James, dealing with customers who said, I want this book. I think it's about, no, I don't know what it's about, but it's blue. And then I have to go find this bloody book. And so I think my brain has actually been trained to think of books by their spine, by their cover. And that's why immediately, it's really funny because when some people discovered that I categorized my book this way, the ABC journalist Virginia Trioli started paying me out. Annabelle Crabb started paying me out. Then they started getting into like their own fight of like good human fight about how Annabelle still can't find Janet Malcolm's book, The Journalist and the Murderer. And within 30 seconds, I had tweeted back a photograph of The Journalist and the Murderer because I'd found it on my bookshelf with the caption of the tweet, I knew it was red. Neither of them could find it, but I think I had the last word with that exchange.
Well, I think with your story about finding books, like that, you are absolutely speaking the language of well, I would say public librarians, but any librarian that's dealt with someone that they want to find something with. It's always, and often it's not actually red. It was probably maroon or even yellow. Do you know what I mean? It could have been a completely different thing, but
totally. It turned out that the font was red, but not the cover.
Exactly, something along those lines. And actually, I might change the view, and you'll see that I'm a little bit more boring in that sense. You see, so but I do
not
have
boring, orderly.
I do have your there you go, your law school book there, strategically placed just to make sure people know that. Oh, and actually, growing up queer just here. There you go.
And growing up queer in Australia, that is very good product placement. You have a good career in TV production and styling ahead of you.
Yeah, that's it. Wow. All right. Well, I guess just really quickly though, as we're talking about books, maybe we could talk all day about your to read pile, because if we talked about mine, it's 15 books big. Do you know what I mean? It's just ridiculous. In fact, I read one and allow that as an excuse to buy two more. So it's just impossible to ever get through them. But what are you reading at the moment? Maybe a couple of cool books at the moment.
Yeah, when the pandemic started, James, I think I was like so many people where I'm like, wow, this is going to be cave time. I'm going to get prison fit and I'm going to read a lot. And I'm not prison fit and I've read decently, but my life kind of got derailed by the Nintendo Switch that I found myself possessing all of a sudden. But the thing is, I am still making my way through that COVID pile, the coronavirus reading stack that I posted on Instagram when all of this started. And from that pile, I'm still reading Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other, which won the Booker Prize, or the most recent Booker Prize, which is fantastic. I mean, I've been looking forward to reading this book for so long, but now that I've nearly finished it, I'm like, I almost want to go back to the start, because all of these different characters within their discrete stories do interrelate and interlink, and I almost want to draw a map of them. And the stories are so brilliantly told, so humane, and so full of compassion and wonder. I'm about to read, I've got another book here that I'm about to start. Going to read my girl Miranda Tapsell's Top End Girl. So Miranda Tapsell, who's a fantastic Australian actor, bit of an icon and a personal mate of mine, but she, like so many Australian authors, just recently released her book but hasn't been able to launch it properly as you usually would. But I know this story has been a long time coming. And, as much as I'm a friend of Miranda's, there's still so much about her upbringing as a Larrakia, Tiwi Islands girl that I still don't know about. I know a bit of her family. I know a bit of her remarkable family story as well. But I'm really looking forward to knowing more. The other thing that I'm looking forward to is reading Ted Chiang, the American science fiction author's book, Exhalation, because his first book of short stories broke my brain. Like no one else is writing like Ted Chiang at the moment. He was responsible for writing the short story collection that included the story that would become the Hollywood film Arrival, just one of the best, most beautiful alien films. So I'm looking forward to him breaking my brain open a second time too.
Thank you so much. I know that, kind of a lot of our kind of patrons will always appreciate a bit of a kind of recommended reads pile. And we'll also link out to, if we can go back and find that tweet, because you do get through the odd tweet or two a day. So we'll go back and find that,
Sure.
that tweet and put links to that, and all these books and all that information we'll put in the video description below and so on. So you'll get all that stuff. So don't frantically miss the rest of this kind of little chat by writing down all those names. So because we're moving on to our final object, the third and final of object to talk about. So what else have you brought with you today?
Okay, so this is this little ordinary looking wooden box. I mean, it's quite cute actually. It's not ordinary, but it's been inscribed with the name Joff Bush. Now, Joff Bush might not be a household name, but his music certainly is renowned throughout Australia. Joff Bush has written music for so many screen and stage projects, but he's probably most famous for writing the theme song to the ABC Kids cartoon Bluey. I think anyone with young kids especially knows that song very, very well and probably have a Pavlovian response to it, for better or for worse. But if I know I'm around kids of a certain age and I start singing, Joff wrote that. Joff also composes a lot of the music to Australian Survivor, if you watch Network 10's Australian Survivor. But he also composed the theme song to the show that I created and co-wrote that was based on my memoir, The Family Law. And if anyone watched that, they might recognize this theme song. So inside that box is a music box. And what Joff does is he scores the song on this parchment that you then feed in to the music box like so. I haven't done this many times, but whenever I do it in front of kids, they're just fascinated. And then when you play it, it plays the theme song to The Family Law, the SBS TV show that we wrote. So let me just play it for you. So the music, I mean, the music for any TV show is often the additional character, right? And, Joff scored so many of the most beautiful and heartbreaking moments of our show, when the mum, Jenny, in the show kicks out the dad in this brutal scene, when Ben, this little teenage character, comes out as gay to his mum, which is just this heart-tearing moment that we have in the show. And that music is always behind all of that stuff. Joff has in some ways scored my life, for which I'll always be grateful. And even though, we've had 3 seasons of that show and we always intended it as a trilogy, and I've really closed that door quite happily, proud of what we've done. This was a period of my life that was over 5 years that was dedicated almost full time just to turning this book into a TV show. It was one of the most grueling yet satisfying periods of work in my life that I've ever had. Like, we formed a community around making this show. And so this very, very lovely artifact that's come out of it is a lovely reminder that actually happened. Yeah, we did end up making the first ever Australian TV show with an Asian Australian family at its core. And yeah, it makes me a little bit sentimental as well, as music can do sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know what I've done in my life to get to this point where I get to, kind of have a chat with Ben Law as you play a little music box across a Zoom meeting that we're going to broadcast. It's kind of a unique scenario. I think that's kind of fun and cool. But I guess it's really interesting, actually, that you mentioned that he scored the theme tune to Bluey. I've got a 3-year-old daughter. So now, whilst I say that as though we watch it because she wants to watch it, the reality is that my wife and I start work 6 minutes late because I normally start at 8, but I start at 7 minutes past 8 because we watch Bluey at 8 o'clock. But I think I think a lot of parents that like that show because they can relate. It's very relatable.
Yeah.
It's very honest. Now, one of the the family law was so popular, and one of the critics I saw, and excuse me, I can't quote them verbatim, but it was along the lines of that you'd done a really great job of a very difficult task, which is to take a normal, and I say normal because no one really knows what that means, but take a normal family and portray that in a TV series, that people I guess could really relate to. And that seemed to me like a real win because, like you say, like that, I guess Australian public are viewing that family as normal. And I say normal, I understand that normal means a lot to different people, but just for the sake of this kind of articulating this conversation, that that's really interesting that they see that as normal, and you managed to do that.
Yeah, I think one of the most gratifying things for us, because TV shows don't exist just by one person's skills or work. One of the great things for us was hearing so many Australians say, "Thank you for telling my story." And of course, there were many Asian Australians who said that because they saw a representation of their families on screen, especially if they came from a Chinese Australian background. But there are plenty of people who came from families where the parents split up and hadn't seen a family like that, or hadn't seen a moment like that on screens representing a family that they were familiar with. There were plenty of people even just from Queensland who said, "Oh my gosh, like a Queensland family, thank you for showing that on screen." And even for some of the minor characters, the opposite the road neighbors in the family law are a Eurasian family with a white dad and a Japanese mum and mixed race kids. And I didn't realize we were doing anything pioneering. I knew that we were having the first Asian Australian family on TV because that was just drilled into us. We spoke about it so often. But I had so much feedback from mixed race Asian families saying, "Oh my gosh, like this is actually one of the few mixed race families that we've seen on television ever. Didn't even realize we were breaking ground in that way." And I don't think that's necessarily a reflection on how, groundbreaking our show was necessarily. In some ways, it was a very sweet family comedy. There are a lot of sweet family comedies out there. But what I think it does reflect is how monocultural and a little bit calcified Australian TV can be. Happily, if people see us as the exception, and I think we are, I'll embrace that. I think Bluey is also an exception, So I think Joff Bush, the composer for both of our shows, has chosen his projects well.
Yeah, he definitely has. And, and look, I really appreciate you giving us that kind of insight into actually so many different angles, from your ancestry and that kind of waltzing the dragon. We talked about that a little bit, about your personal kind of life when you talk about how you kind of categorize your books and have a little bit of a conversation around that. That's kind of cool. And now we've finished with the family law and Joff Bush, sorry, and the music box. I know that you're like I've said before, we're so appreciative that you take the time to speak to us because, everyone's got their story, and certainly yours is varied and one that, is really interesting to hear about, and we appreciate that. But I'm afraid that's the end of our event. And so I just want to take the opportunity to thank you, and hopefully we'll get the chance to maybe do this in person at one of our libraries, and you can take a travel back up towards the Sunshine Coast, and we can go and, you can maybe even take me on, as you say, in one in your but in the family law, I think it is, or where it says that you could take someone on a tour of your father's
of my father's successful and failed businesses.
Yeah, maybe we could take that tour. We could
Totally.
bring some of our patrons along with you.
That would be great. Well, look, I would love to come back to Queensland because it's where so much of my family is. But in the meantime, this has been really fun.
Cool. Take care. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, James.